Ready to level up your career? Text DISH to 44043 now to dive into a world of exciting technician opportunities at DISH. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, DISH offers the perfect platform for your success. Connect with us today to discover how you can be part of a dynamic team driving innovation. Connect today and join the DISH family, where innovation meets opportunity. Text DISH to 44043 to kickstart your journey towards a rewarding career.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and we have read all of Agatha Christie's novels by this point. We have ranked all of Agatha Christie's novels by this point. But that does not mean we cannot talk about those rankings as much as we would like. And I'm happy to say that this episode is going to be a post-State of the Rankings episode in which I do a little bit of post-game analysis of where the rankings ended up after my conversation with the one and only Dr. John Curran. I'm also able to do a little compare and contrast project here, I'm thrilled to report, because I managed to get my hot little hands on 2 alternate ranking grids. 2 alternate ranking grids that rank every single one of Agatha Christie's 66 mystery novels. So first up, I want to let you all know that by the time this episode has come out, I will have posted links to those alternative rankings on the podcast's Twitter and Instagram and Facebook feeds for good measure. A couple of you reached out after I posted the final All About Agatha rankings and said that they were really hard to read. So what I'm going to try to do is to link to a Google Doc, which I think will be much more readable and expandable for people. We'll see how that works, but I will have posted something by the time you're listening to this. So if you would like to look at those alternative rankings, I think it would enhance this conversation greatly, although you do not have to. You can head on over to Twitter. The podcast is at All About the Dame, or on Instagram at All About Agatha. And on Facebook, the Facebook page is also All About Agatha. First up, before I get into those alternative rankings, I just wanted to take stock of something that crystallized during my lengthy conversation with Dr. Curran. And that has to do with the mystery novel titled Nemesis. That will probably not come as a surprise to anyone who has listened to that episode. Nemesis was a big point of contention between John and me. To put it simply, I ranked Nemesis much higher than John did because for me, Nemesis is a very important and very successful novel as to character, specifically as the true final Miss Marple novel that we have. I value Nemesis because it gets inside Miss Marple's head. I think it's such a convincing and satisfying evocation of Miss Marple in her final case. Yes, I do, of course, realize that Sleeping Murder is technically the final Miss Marple, but as I've spoken about ad nauseum at this point, Nemesis feels like the true final Miss Marple. And I just think you can't overstate the value of that book as to Miss Marple and as to Christie's craftsmanship in evoking Miss Marple. My adversary, John, Dr. Curran, he would rank Nemesis much lower because his focus is a little more squarely, though not solely, on the puzzle aspect of Christie's books. I'm speaking a little bit for him now, but I believe this is accurate to say that he is first and foremost an aficionado of the detective fiction genre of the Golden Age, which does rest on the puzzle mystery as the most fundamental building block of those mystery novels. So for him, Nemesis is a bit of a mess because the puzzle in Nemesis is a bit of a mess. The puzzle is practically non-existent, and even just the plain old plot, A to B to C to D to E from beginning to end of the book, is meandering and certainly not Christie's best. I do not disagree with that statement, but the other non-puzzle, non-plot aspects of Nemesis by far outweigh any distaste I have for its puzzle/plot. So I think what it really comes down to is, what are we evaluating when we're evaluating an Agatha Christie mystery novel? Are we primarily evaluating a puzzle, or are we evaluating a piece of fiction, a story that has many aspects, a puzzle being just one of them? And I know for a fact there are a lot of people who would agree with John Curran here that we should be focusing primarily, or at least more heavily, on the puzzle aspect of Christie's novels, because that is where her true genius shines through. What I learned as a result of my conversation with John is that I don't actually agree with that statement, even though I probably kind of sort of thought that I did before the episode. I think that Christie's cleverness, her genius, let's just call it genius, when it comes to puzzles, is a huge, huge part of why she is as successful and beloved as she is today. But I firmly believe it's not the only reason. And even though the other aspects of the craft of writing, characterization, setting, dialogue, are perhaps not consistently done better by Christie than by many other successful authors, even though that is the case, whereas she does consistently do puzzle construction better than any other author. Even though that's the case, I think it's the combination of her writerly abilities as to all of these elements. It's the sum of the parts that makes her as much of a standout, as much of an exception as she is. So I will continue to judge Nemesis as not just a piece of detective fiction, but a work of literature. And as a work of literature, I think it is pretty fantastic. And I wish it was a little higher in the rankings, but that's okay. I'm pretty happy with where it ended up. And I've heard from a number of you about this Nemesis situation, but this is the kind of thing I could talk about forever. So if you have other thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. And on that note, I would like to now transition to one of those alternative rankings grids that I came across. And I came across it because it was one of you listeners who sent it to me. That's right. An A+++ listener out there. You know who you are. This wonderful person sent me an email with an attachment. And the attachment was a grid that looked very similar to the All About Agatha rankings grid, because this listener used the same categories and the same scoring system for purposes of easy comparison. And I so appreciated that. Now, this is the first grid that I uploaded to the podcast's social media accounts. I titled it Listener Grid. And upon first glance, comparing it to the All About Agatha grid, I am struck by just how many of the same titles we both have in the top 10. In fact, the top 8 of 10 titles on the All About Agatha grid also appear in this listener's top 10. Sure, they're a little switched around, and Then There Were None is just ahead of Five Little Pigs. So, And Then There Were None is in the number 1 spot. That's fine. Followed by Murder of Roger Ackroyd, of course. And we've got Endless Night, Death on the Nile, Murder on the Orient Express, A Murder is Announced, Crooked House. I'm so happy about all of those. The All About Agatha number 10 is, of course, Peril at End House. And that appears at number 12 here on this listener's grid. So that too is forgivable. The big difference is that The Hollow is ranked number 9 by All About Agatha. And this listener has it ranked at number 21. In its place, by the way, is the ABC Murders. So you know that John Curran, if he is listening, and I hope he is loving this listener's grid, because ABC Murders is getting the love. The Hollow is getting the shaft. But this A triple plus listener not only sent me an alternative grid, he also annotated that grid. So here is what he had to say about the Hollow, because he too pointed out that this title falls in a much different place in his grid. Oh, and by the way, before I start getting into any of these specific titles, there very well may be some minor spoilers here of some of these books. So if you're worried about spoilers, you might want to skip this episode, but I will ensure that none of the spoilers is major. So I'm not going to spill that blank did it or anything like that. Okay, so here's what he had to say about the Hollow. I love the Hollow's characters and tone, but find the mystery plot weak and unconvincing. My main objection to your 9 in credibility is that I don't buy that John could convey with a single dying word what the plot requires him to convey, or that all the characters who joined the cover-up would do it so quickly and seamlessly. Fair enough, though I still think 21 is shockingly, absurdly, tragically low for a book as brilliant as The Hollow. Dare I say that The Hollow is another one of these nemesis-like books where one's appreciation for some of the non-puzzly aspects, in particular character, will bump it up significantly. Although I still think the puzzle construction of The Hollow is quite brilliant. It's unusual, which is yet another point in its favor, but it's absolutely brilliant. Overall, this listener really did, in a very John Curran-ish way, I think, weigh clever puzzle construction much more heavily than Catherine and I did when we were assigning scores. And he noted this, writing, Death on the Nile, Evil Under the Sun, The ABC Murders, and Hercule Poirot's Christmas all got 9s in plot mechanics from him, whereas they mainly got somewhat lower scores on the All About Agatha grid. And I understand that. I think I've always been slightly uncomfortable with the placement of Evil Under the Sun, The ABC Murders, and Hercule Poirot's Christmas. That last one will come as no surprise to anyone because I have been mercilessly bumping it up each year. But I agree that those titles are almost archetypal when it comes to what Christie does best. And I think they are some of her best for that reason, and they should be quite high. And they are ultimately pretty high on the All About Agatha grid. But I understand wanting to bump them up even a little higher. I think you can absolutely defend that position. So interestingly, we have a little bit of a reverse The Hollow situation when it comes to Sparkling Cyanide. This title falls at number 33, so just in the top half on the All About Agatha grid. It comes in at 16 on the listener's grid. And this is what he had to say about that. I think its solution is very clever, especially in the identity and motivation of the murderers and how these are concealed, although I agree that the specifics of what happens are unlikely. I also find both the characters and the overall literary merit tone of the book higher than you did. So for me, it goes firmly in the top 20. And I think that just comes down to a difference in taste because I like the visual trick of Sparkling Cyanide. And this is a fairly spoilery statement to make. So fast forward, actually, if you haven't yet read Sparkling Cyanide, I don't want to ruin that book for anyone. But it's one of those rare instances where I think Christie went for a visually elegant and arresting solution that isn't all that believable. I still just don't actually believe that everyone would have been shifted one position over on the table in that way. I just don't buy it. And even though we often have these nitpicks when it comes to a mystery novel of, well, would they really been able to run around as quickly and time everything as perfectly as they did, et cetera, those are all tangential nitpicks, whereas the underlying trick is almost always extremely compelling and convincing in Christie. And that trick of the shift in place setting on the table, that is what underlies the whole thing. That's not just a quibble, and it bothers me. So I just don't think that Sparkling Cyanide is one of Christie's best puzzles. And that's why it got a 6 in plot mechanics and a 4 in plot credibility on the All About Agatha grid. Whereas on the listener's grid, it got an 8 in plot mechanics and a 5 in plot credibility. And he did also rank it higher for book-specific characters and for setting and tone. And I'll be honest with you, I've mentioned this before. Catherine and I both really enjoyed reading Sparkling Cyanide, and we were fairly rapturous about it. I think specifically about the characters in the episode we recorded, which of course was right after we read it. But then as time went by, we just got much less excited about it. And it's really just sunk in the rankings since then. But I hold to that opinion, and I ultimately feel like there's something trashy about that book. Could that have to do with the fact that it's a dinner club setting? Maybe, but I really don't feel that way about any of Christie's other books. And I just don't have that much affection for it as I do for so many of her other titles. I'm curious if others feel that way. Perhaps that's just my own hang up. Obviously, this listener liked it a whole lot more. So I wanted to highlight that alternative point of view. And I'm genuinely curious how other people feel about Sparkling Cyanide. Because there's an argument to be made that it actually is a really great Christie, but I just don't feel like it is. Okay, another shocking difference is Murder at the Vicarage, which lands in 22nd place on this listener's grid, just in the top third. Of course, in the All About Agatha grid, it's in 12th place. I really wish there were a way to have the Murder at the Vicarage in our top 10, along with Peril at N House, but there are just too many good titles, which is why it had to even get bumped to 12th below the ABC Murders. And I just adore that title, but this listener feels differently. He writes, on Vicarage, I find the Rube Goldberg nature of the murder plot, plus all the dozen intersecting subplots for other suspects, quite artificial and unconvincing. And that is more than fair. The side plots in that book are just crazy pants because there are so many of them and they all sort of tie together too neatly. And it does feel artificial. And I think that is a mistake that she did not really make again or did not make as often in later books. That was almost like the end of the rookie period for Agatha Christie as a writer. I think, from there, she headed on into the 30s and she was just at the top of her game through to the 40s and beyond. So I can understand that position. There are two other books that this listener ranked more highly than we did, and I just want to highlight them as well. The first is Pocketful of Rye. Here's what this listener had to say about that title. I find the central trick of Pocket very clever. You can think of it as a reworking of Mysterious Affair at Styles, added to a subversion of the nursery rhyme-obsessed serial killer motif that Christie played straight in And Then There Were None and in The Mousetrap. And I would add in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, which is something that John Curran and I touched on in our conversation. And I never thought about Pocketful of Rye as a reworking of The Mysterious Affair at Styles. I won't get too specific about that, but it has to do with the most likely suspect being proven innocent and then, of course, being proven guilty at the end. That is ye old double bluff that Christie did time and time again. But the way she pulls off this double bluff is that the most likely suspect was working in concert with someone else. And she just did this so many times. She did this in Death on the Nile. She did this in The Murder at the Vicarage. She did this in a lot of titles. But my esteem for A Pocketful of Rye has only risen and continues to rise the more that I think about it. And it sits on this listener's grid at number 24, whereas in the All About Agatha grid, it's at number 36. And I do feel that it should be a little higher. And you know what? Nemesis is right above A Pocketful of Rye at number 35. I think both of those titles should be a bit higher than they are. Not too much higher, but a bit. Conversely, as to another Miss Marple title, this listener ranked They Do It With Mirrors lower than where it falls on the All About Agatha grid. We have it in 44th place, and this listener ranked it 50th. He writes, for you, it's middle of the road, and for me, it's almost the worst of the pure puzzle mysteries. Not because of anything actively bad with it, but because of how lackluster and forgettable it is in all its aspects. Oof. Strong words there about They Do It With Mirrors, but I completely understand that position as well. That really is one of very few Christie puzzles that does feel lackluster and perhaps a little easily solvable and just not Christie firing on all cylinders. We often use that sort of language when we're describing the Christie thrillers. It's very unusual to use that language as to a Christie puzzle mystery, but They Do It With Mirrors is simply not one of Christie's best. Relative statement. And then I'll end my comparison of these two grids with one final title. That would be The Mystery of the Blue Train, which we have ranked fairly low. It is sitting at 54th place out of 66 books. And this listener ranked it significantly higher in 42nd place. And this is what he had to say about that. I think The Mystery of the Blue Train is a bit underrated by you, dragged down by being, quote, the one Christie hated, end quote, and, quote, the one with the ghost, end quote. Yes and yes, but on the other hand, the solution is ingenious and decently clued, and Catherine Gray is a likable and memorable protagonist. I think you rated it more fairly on your first take on it, and then gradually lowered its score unfairly in revision episodes, thinking only of the two dings I mentioned and not of its positive qualities. And that's an interesting point. I would actually love to trace the trajectory of titles from when we first ranked them, keeping track of how much they may have risen or fallen each year thereafter in our State of the Rankings episodes. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. I'm not that far gone that I'm going to actually start tracking that. But I think this listener is absolutely right, because I remember being surprised by how much I liked The Mystery of the Blue Train. I never loved it. It's not one of my favorites, but I think that Christie's hatred for it had so much more to do with where she was at the time that she was writing it and the fact that she felt forced to write it because she was really worried about having material to publish. Catherine always felt very strongly about keeping The Mystery of the Blue Train low out of loyalty to Agatha Christie. And I'm totally okay with that. So I have no problem with where it is. I don't think many people are losing much sleep over the placement of The Mystery of the Blue Train in the All About Agatha rankings grid. I hope that no one is losing sleep about the placement of any title in the All About Agatha rankings grid, frankly. This is all supposed to be fun and a diverting intellectual exercise, after all. But I think that's a really interesting point of view and another trenchant observation by this overachiever of a listener who actually took the time and effort to make this grid. And I'm so appreciative of it. And it gave me so much joy. And I just wanted to share some of that joy with all of you and give him the satisfaction of airing a few of those positions he defended so well. Thank you so much, listener. I really, really appreciate it. Hello, listeners. I'd like to tell you about a new history podcast out there in the world called The Art of Crime, which is about unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts. Season 1 is titled The Unusual Suspects, Artists Accused of Being Jack the Ripper. It profiles 6 renowned artists who have fallen under suspicion as the Whitechapel murderer. How's that for an intriguing premise? The Art of Crime covers an array of artistic media, the worlds of costume design, theater, music halls, poetry, and painting. But fans of books in general, and crime writing in particular, will find a ton to enjoy here. The first season alone examines authors like Arthur Conan Doyle, Patricia Cornwell, and Robert Louis Stevenson. If you are the kind of listener who is fascinated to learn that legendary stage actress Ruth Draper inspired the character of Carlotta Adams in Lord Edward Dies, or that the notorious Lindbergh kidnapping hangs over the plot of Murder on the Orient Express, then this podcast is for you. So subscribe today wherever you get your podcasts and make sure to visit www.artofcrimepodcast.com. All right, it is time to discuss the second alternative rankings grid that we have for Christie's oeuvre. About 8 months ago, a listener reached out to me. This listener is currently living in Tokyo. And one of the things that she had gotten in the habit of doing while in Tokyo was to sit in on the bi-monthly meetings of a group of Japanese Christie scholars who would discuss various aspects of her work, just as we do here on this podcast, including the translation of her texts into Japanese, as well as theatrical and film versions of Christie's works in Japanese. And I should note that Catherine and I spoke about the Japanese anime series Agatha Christie's Great Detectives, Poirot and Marple in a Patreon episode from a while back. We really loved that series, actually. There's a lot of interesting adaptational content coming out of Japan having to do with Agatha Christie. So anyway, there was one of these Christie scholars from Japan who this listener wanted to tell me about in particular. And this would be a man named Yasuo Sudoh, who, when he was a graduate student, wrote a letter to Agatha Christie asking her about the function of a gadget that was crucial to the plot of the murder of Roger Ackroyd. Now, I don't know this for sure, but I'm imagining that had to be the dictaphone that appears in the murder of Roger Ackroyd. And Agatha Christie wrote him back. And this led to a correspondence between Mr. Sudoh and Dame Agatha in and around the late 60s and early 70s. So this is very late in Agatha Christie's career. And that correspondence included Agatha Christie listing her top 10 among all her titles. And, I don't think that I have done this before. And since this episode is all about alternative rankings, I think I should go ahead and list Christie's own personal rankings, which she sent to Mr. Sudoh. She did this in 1972. And the list is fascinating because she, like my A+ listener from earlier in the episode, annotated her list. So here goes. This is Agatha Christie's 10 favorite books. And I'm actually reading this off of the official agathachristie.com website. My own 10 would certainly vary from time to time because every now and then I reread an early book for some particular reason to answer a question that has been asked me perhaps, and then I alter my opinion, sometimes thinking it is much better than I thought it was or not so good as I had thought. So even Christie herself would waver and change her mind when it came to ranking her titles. That makes me feel better. Continuing on. At the moment, my own list would possibly be, and then there were none. A difficult technique which was a challenge, and so I enjoyed it, and I think dealt with it satisfactorily. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, a general favorite. A murder is announced. I thought all the characters interesting to write about and felt I knew them quite well by the time the book was finished. Murder on the Orient Express. Again, because it was a new idea for a plot. The 13 Problems, a good series of stories. Towards Zero. I found it interesting to work on the idea of people from different places coming towards a murder instead of starting with the murder and working from that. Endless Night, my own favorite at present. Keep in mind, she's writing this in 1972, so Endless Night was fresh in her mind. Crooked House. I found a study of a certain family interesting to explore. Ordeal by Innocence. An idea I had had for some time before starting to work upon it. And finally, The Moving Finger, which I have reread lately and enjoyed reading it again very much. Now, in her autobiography, she mentions Ordeal by Innocence and The Moving Finger as two of her books that she does quite esteem and appreciate. So it's interesting that she mentions those two titles again here at the end of her list. Other than those two titles, I'm pretty pleased by this list that Agatha Christie herself made because there is a ton of overlap here between the All About Agatha top 10 and Agatha Christie's top 10 in 1972 at a very specific point in time. 6 of the titles Christie mentions in her top 10 appear in the All About Agatha top 10. And then there were none. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, A Murder is Announced, Murder on the Orient Express, Endless Night, and Crooked House. She also included a collection of short stories, The 13 Problems. We only considered novels for our rankings project, but if pushed, I think that that would be my favorite short story collection of Christie's because I think that Miss Marple shines in short story form like no other character, despite all of the many, many, many good Poirot short stories that we have. The Labours of Hercules is a close second, but I think I agree with Christie about The 13 Problems. Apparently, Christie had no idea how brilliant Five Little Pigs is. But that is a song I will continue to sing for as long as anyone will listen to me. And let's be honest, even beyond that point. So back to this Japanese fan to whom Christie sent this list all the way back in 1972. They had such a robust back and forth that 6 years after their first exchange of letters, Agatha Christie actually invited Mr. Sudoh to come visit her in England. And naturally, he took her up on that offer. How could he not? She received him at Greenway. He spent 2 days there. He said they were, quote, like a dream. I'm sure they were. And then when he returned to Japan, Mr. Sudoh continued to be an Agatha Christie super fan. He conducted lectures and became an established agathologist within his home country. And this All About Agatha listener who contacted me, she got to know Mr. Sudoh. And she said that in his lectures, he would regularly refer to a ranking of all 66 of Christie's novels that had been done by the Agatha Christie fan club in Japan all the way back in 1982, in which each voter assigned a numerical value from 1 to 10 for each Christie book that they read. So for this reason, the number of votes for each book is not consistent, but for almost all of the titles, there were at least 40 votes. And for some of the titles, there were nearly twice that number. This is the second grid that I have posted on social media. I've titled it Japan Fan Club Grid. And I am just fascinated by this grid because it has some interesting similarities and some interesting differences. So let's do a little compare and contrast here. First of all, the top title is And Then There Were None. I don't think that will shock anyone. And the second ranked title is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, followed by Murder on the Orient Express, A Murder is Announced, and Death on the Nile. So that is a top 5 that feels very comfortable. I think we can say with confidence that those 5 titles are almost universally esteemed by Christie fans, scholars, and readers down the ages. You start getting a little more controversial when you add titles like Periled End House, The Hollow, Endless Night, even Crooked House to the top 10. And I remember saying this when Catherine and I put Five Little Pigs in the top spot. One of the reasons why I was so happy to do so is that it's not super obvious. I think if you asked most people to guess what the top rated Agatha Christie title is, that most people with any sort of working knowledge of Christie would say, oh, it has to be And Then There Were None. And that's warranted. And I know that many of you feel very strongly that it should be And Then There Were None. But I like the fact that we have an alternate top title in our grid. I really cherish that. I will note that on this fan club grid, Five Little Pigs is in 37th place. Mon Dieu. I can't even. The biggest drawback to this grid, or I should just say difference, is that the scoring is not broken down by category. So we can't get much of a sense as to why these titles were ranked the way that they were by these members of the Agatha Christie fan club in Japan. But that's okay. We'll work with what we have here. The title that gets the number 6 spot is Curtain, actually. And let's just remember that this list was created in 1982. So Curtain was still very fresh, I think, in people's minds, as was the death of Agatha Christie herself. And I have to imagine that the emotional punch that Curtain packed when it came out was still very much reverberating for people. I'm not surprised that Curtain is significantly higher on this list than it is on the All About Agatha list, which was created at such a remove from the initial publication of any of Christie's novels. I thought that was really interesting. Rounding out the top 10 here, we have Towards Zero in 7th place, then the ABC Murders, After the Funeral, and Evil Under the Sun. Once again, Evil Under the Sun is in 18th place on the All About Agatha grid. I actually think that is fine because there's nothing above it that I think is better than that title, but I'm not surprised that Evil Under the Sun hit the top 10 here. In 11th place, we have Sleeping Murder. And in 12th place, we have By the Pricking of My Thumbs. Now, Sleeping Murder, of course, came out in 1976, so even later than Curtain. So that was even fresher, I think, in these voters' minds when this list was created. And By the Pricking of My Thumbs came out in the late 60s, so perhaps that too stuck out in a way that it wouldn't today. That is the only reason I can come up with as to why By the Pricking of My Thumbs would be in 12th place. I am otherwise baffled. If anyone has any light to shed on that, please do let me know. In 13th place, we have 450 from Paddington, which clocks in at 30th place on the All About Agatha grid. I had actually been thinking that perhaps 450 from Paddington was a bit high on our grid, but this is making me feel better about that. After that, we have Crooked House, then 3-Act Tragedy in 15th place. I really do love 3-Act Tragedy. I know that a lot of listeners think that I love it too much and that it is overrated on this podcast, but I really don't think it is. Go back and reread it. It's just so brilliant. It's Christie at the height of her powers, and it's such a Christie-ish book. We have it in 19th place, so I like that it gets a few ticks higher here on this grid. Then we have in 16th place, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. I like giving props for the first book out the gate. On the All About Agatha grid, The Mysterious Affair at Styles is in 31st place. I have been steadily bumping that title up year after year because I do want to give it its due as Christie's debut novel. I think 16th place is a bit high, but that's nice. But then in 17th place, and I so hope that my dear friend John Curran is listening to this episode, because the 17th spot is occupied by none other than 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. Vindication for John Curran. I'm so glad I didn't cut out his impassioned defense of 1-2 Buckle My Shoe from that episode, because apparently he was onto something there. I joke, of course he was onto something. I understand for those who are more puzzle-minded why 1-2 Buckle My Shoe might rate higher than it did on the podcast. And, that brings to mind, actually, something that I talked about with the YA mystery novelist Maureen Johnson in the last episode of the podcast. We brought up the Japanese mystery author Seishi Yokomizo, who wrote The Hanjin Murders, which was recently translated into English. And that was a title that we had both read and really appreciated. It's very much a puzzle mystery. And I am not going to hold myself out here as an expert on Japanese mysteries. So I will carefully avoid making any blanket statements here. But based on the fact that Yokomizo wrote 77 mysteries featuring the fictional detective who appears in the Hanjin Murders, I would imagine that these books were very popular in Japan and that there's a robust appreciation and appetite for puzzle mysteries and puzzle construction. So I'm not surprised to see that the puzzle aspect of Christie's novels seems to be weighted a bit more heavily on this grid, compiling the votes of members of the Agatha Christie fan club in Japan. That makes a lot of sense to me. So, perhaps that's why Murder in Mesopotamia is in 19th place and A Pocket Full of Rye in 20th place. Catherine's beloved Parallel End House is in 21st place, just making the top third. And then, happy day, The Man in the Brown Suit at number 22. That is going to horrify some people. But if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that my and Catherine's love of The Man in the Brown Suit knows no bounds. We managed to restrain ourselves and keep it relatively low in our grid. It sits in 41st place in the final rankings. But I love that The Man in the Brown Suit sneaks into the top third here. That perhaps belies the point I just made about Japanese readers favoring the more puzzly Christie's, as would the fact that Why Didn't They Ask Evans is in 29th place and N.R.M. in 30th place. Although those really are three thriller or thriller-ish titles that feature some clever puzzle construction. So perhaps I am making sense after all. Nemesis is in 32nd place, woohoo, top half, and The Body in the Library squeaks in, resting at 33 out of 66 titles. I'm going to skip on over most of the bottom half of this grid. I really do encourage you to peruse it if you have some time. But I'd like to just read out the bottom 10 titles on this grid, because I think it's really interesting to see what these Japanese readers liked the least and whether or not that lines up with our thinking on the All About Agatha grid. So here goes. Starting in 57th place, we have Postern of Fate, Dumb Witness, Endless Night, Third Girl, The Clocks, They Do It With Mirrors, Hickory Dickory Dock, The Big Four, The Mystery of the Blue Train, and in dead last place, Passenger to Frankfurt. That is so interesting. Why is Endless Night in 59th place? That makes no sense to me. Well, fortunately, I actually have an answer as to why Endless Night appears so outrageously low on this grid. You'll notice that the final column is labeled deviation value. And this has to do with how much the numerical values each of the voters assigned a specific title differed from each other. A deviation less than 1 means that there essentially was no deviation, i.e., everyone pretty much agreed. There was only one title here that has a deviation value of less than 1. And surprise, surprise, and then there were none. And there's a little notation here on the grid which says the only 0 deviation value. Everyone agreed. So everyone thought that and then there were none was clearly Christie's number 1 title. And then for the most part, the deviation values fall somewhere between 1 and 2, but there are 2 exceptions. And the first is the Big Four, which has a deviation of 2.03. That's the second largest deviation here on the grid. And hey, I get it. I think that the Big Four is an inherently confusing book to rank because it really is a collection of short stories. I just finished saying that we chose not to include short story collections in the All About Agatha grid, which is why we didn't include the 13 problems as Agatha Christie did when she wrote to Mr. Sudoh. But you could make the argument that we did do that because we kept the Big Four here in the grid. And the Big Four really is considered a full-length novel. It was made into a full-length novel. I think it was made pretty badly into a full-length novel. You know, there is a theory, I don't think it's supported by a lot of hard evidence, that Christie herself might not have even been the one to stitch together those short stories into the full-length novel that exists as the Big Four. Regardless, it's an awkward fit of a book. And I think that people sometimes don't know how to approach it. And there are those who enjoy some of the miniature puzzles that appear in the course of the Big Four and who appreciate it as a collection of short stories. And then there are others who focus on the absurdity of the interstitial matter, especially toward the end of that book. So fair enough on a pretty big deviation there for the Big Four. But the title with the largest deviation is Endless Night. It had a deviation of 2.15, and here's the note on that. The largest deviation. Quite a lot of people, those who focus on plot tricks, hated it for similarity to the murder of Roger Ackroyd. That is really interesting. And that both supports and refutes my theory as to Japanese readers perhaps tending to favor the puzzle aspects of these books over other aspects. It sounds like there were many readers who did do this, but then there were many readers who did not. But the fact that there were some readers who were incensed by the similarity between Endless Night and the murder of Roger Ackroyd, I think shows that the puzzle aspect of these books was of supreme importance to at least some of these voters. I stick to the notion that this is Christie doing what Christie did all throughout her career, recycling unlike any other. My guess would be that the trick she pulls off in the murder of Roger Ackroyd is so specific that unlike the recycling taking place between other books, which can very easily go unnoticed unless you are someone like me who decides to sit back and pick apart these books, sort of pull out their spine and examine their structure. It's only then that you start realizing just how similar so many of these books are. And that's something I cherish about Christie. But there is an obviousness, I think, when you get to the end of Endless Night, in terms of the similarity between that book and the murder of Roger Ackroyd and the very specific trick that Christie is pulling off in both of those books, especially for a reader laser focused on the puzzle aspects of these books. So that's really, really interesting to me. There's so much more I could say about this grid in and of itself, and about other ways in which it deviates from the All About Agatha grid, et cetera, et cetera. But I will leave it there and encourage you yet again to take a closer look at that grid on one of our social media accounts. It is not lost on me that in my interactions with Dr. John Curran and with my A+ student listener who submitted his own alternative grid, and with this grid compiled in 1982 by the Agatha Christie fan club in Japan, that in all of these cases, these alternative grids, or in John Curran's case, his alternative opinions, have to do with weighting the puzzle or plotting elements of Christie's novels more heavily than Catherine and I did when we were conducting our ranking exercise. I am 100% okay with that because we always knew from the start that we were choosing to focus on aspects of Christie's craft that many readers do not, and even that many scholars of Christie do not. It's kind of the raison d'etre, that was for you, Catherine, of the podcast to make the point that even though we should be celebrating Christie for her puzzle construction and giving her all the props in the world for how clever / brilliant / genius she was when it came to puzzle construction, that she was capable of doing a lot more than that. And we've spent 6 years shining a light on that and how important that is. So I have no regrets that in this way, it's the All About Agatha grid that is the outlier here. And that is just fine, because if Monsieur Poirot and Miss Marple have taught me anything over these years, it's that looking in from the outside is a good place to be. An outsider is a very powerful thing. So did you think that I was done talking about rankings after this extravaganza of an episode? With apologies to Passenger to Frankfurt, although Passenger to Frankfurt deserves no apologies. Of course I'm not done talking about rankings. And to prove it, in my very next episode, in 2 weeks' time, I will be revisiting The Secret of Chimneys. That's right. Christmas is coming so early, it feels late for some of you, because I know that there are listeners out there who have been outraged for years now that The Secret of Chimneys is ranked as low as it is. Catherine and I joked about this for so long that we were going to revisit that dreaded book. Well, it's bite the bullet time, because I'm going to do it. And I'm determined to live to tell the tale and to give The Secret of Chimneys its second day in court. We shall see how it fares. I am leaving the possibility open for adjusting the placement of The Secret of Chimneys in the rankings grid. So that's very exciting. Feel free to reread it yourself if you would like. I dare you. And in the meantime, if you haven't gotten enough of me, you can head on over to the podcast's Patreon account at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. I have included a link in the notes to this episode. You can get bonus episodes from me over the past year, and from me and Catherine in the episodes we recorded prior to her passing at the end of 2021. There are a lot of them, a lot of content there. My last episode, in fact, was a review of Rian Johnson's Glass Onion. And for 4 more days till the end of this long weekend here in the United States, we are celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday. That review will be free. Should you visit the podcast's Patreon page, you can just click right on it and play it for yourself. And if you like what you hear, I'd love for you to subscribe and become a patron. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And I already mentioned the podcast's social media handles at the top of the episode, but I will mention them once again. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And even though I don't regularly update the podcast's Facebook page, you can also go to the Facebook page All About Agatha, especially if you want to access any of those documents I referenced over the course of this episode. Please give the podcast a rating and or a review if you haven't yet done so. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.